Thank you, Professor. I'm very pleased and deeply honored to be invited to speak today as a member of this esteemed panel. I come to this discussion from a perspective gained from spending the first half of my career working as a Jewish woman in a variety of NGO and governmental organizations, where I pursued my particular Jewish values in secular organizations devoted to promoting universal American values of social justice for all. My work was informed by my strong Jewish education in the conservative movement of Judaism and through leadership in the B'nai B'rith youth organization, where I was sent on my first trip to Israel in 1967, 3 weeks after the Six-Day War. It was not, however, until 22 years ago, when I entered the field of Jewish communal service, that I was able to integrate my particular Jewish identity with my universal commitment to social justice and pursue those same goals through a particular Jewish lens. As Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston, an agency of Boston's Jewish Federation, and now as CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women, I have had the privilege of representing the values and traditions of our relatively small American Jewish community to NGOs, government, and other faith traditions in order to fight for justice for all. Those of us who toil in the field of advocacy in the secular world as Jews are keenly aware that until and unless we have a society where all people achieve dignity and justice, we will not be able to thrive as Jews, whether as a minority, as we are in the United States, or as a majority, as you are here in Israel. And let us remember that well over 50% of us are women. The National Council of Jewish Women was founded 120 years ago by a woman named Hannah G. Solomon, who was invited to the Academy of World Religions in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. And when she got there, she was asked to pour the tea. Hannah G. Solomon decided there and then that Jewish women could do more for humanity than pour tea. And she returned to her community in Chicago and became a student of the Settlement House movement, founded by Jane Addams, a feminist community worker. She decided to take her particular Jewish values and organize other Jewish women to reach out to all women and children who were suffering in poverty, lacked education, and were victims of poor health and terrible working and housing conditions. Hannah G. Solomon was a true feminist pioneer who challenged the women of her time with the question, who is this new woman? She is the woman who dares to go into the world and do what her convictions demand. What began in one city in the Midwest extended to hundreds of communities across the United States, and eventually through the International Council of Jewish Women to over 50 countries across the world, including Israel. NCJW was one of the very first national Jewish organizations to be organized in America. While it was formed to address the domestic challenges facing women and children, Hadassah was created 2 decades later based on the NCJW model as a women's Zionist organization. NCJW today continues to be the primary progressive Jewish women's organization in the United States, with 88 affiliates across the country, representing tens of thousands of women in communities large and small, who were inspired by Jewish values to strive for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. This vision has put us as Jewish women on the cutting edge of all the most important social movements in the United States over the past century, including the fight for the women's right to vote, the ability of women to make their own reproductive choices, the effort to ensure paycheck fairness, an end to trafficking and violence against women, and the struggle to achieve comprehensive immigration reform that we are now involved with. Keeping in mind the biblical injunction to help repair this broken world, NCJW tackled the contentious issue of racial segregation in the United States and played an important role in many communities, building bridges with other racial and ethnic groups. More recently, we've been at the forefront of the civil rights struggle of our times, the rights of gays and lesbians to be free of discrimination. Given our status as a religious minority, we also work to keep religion and state separated, as mandated by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. We lobby Congress and the President, we rally in our state capitals, and we show up at local government meetings. We push for the appointment of mainstream judges to be appointed so our courts will be places of fairness and balanced jurisprudence. This work is mirrored in our philanthropic and advocacy work here in Israel. I want to be clear that everything we do in regard to Israel, we do because of our unequivocal support for Israel to thrive as a Jewish, democratic state, and our commitment to ensure her long-term strength and viability. Israel is family for us. Within the family, we disagree, we argue, but ultimately we come together for everyone's welfare. And in the modern family, everyone has a say at the table. And that is the spirit we bring to this discussion. NCJW's commitment to Israel goes way back. When Jewish women formed NCJW in 1893, achieving a Jewish state seemed like a far-fetched dream. But within 40 years, NCJW was helping women escape Europe and laying the ground for assisting those arriving in Israel both before and after the state was formally established. We helped build institutions like the Hebrew University High School in Jerusalem, and we established the NCJW Research Institute for Innovation in Education at Hebrew University to assist at-risk children from all segments of Israeli society. As the women's movement grew in Israel, as elsewhere, we formed and established the NCJW Women and Gender Studies program there with a $1 million endowment. We've initiated in Israel granting programs, and we merged with the U.S.-Israel Women to Women program. I'll talk later about Agunot and our work with ICAR, and are joining the struggle against gender segregation, supporting efforts to end illegal segregation on public bus lines, and advocating zero tolerance for those who attempt to separate women from men on the sidewalk, on billboards, on government panels, and anywhere else in the public square where discrimination has raised its ugly head. These actions are inspired by our view that our Judaism demands action when faced with injustice. It is informed by a belief at our very core that the voices and concerns of women can no longer be silenced as they once were in our classical texts and religious conversations. The Judaism we embrace acknowledges the complete equality of women by accepting us as full partners in all phases of Jewish life. In concluding, I want to mention a wonderful book called Engendering Judaism by Rachel Adler. She talks about Judaism's commitment to justice, which obligates us to understand and redress gender inequality. She points out that gender has been used to justify unequal distributions of social power and privilege, and that these power disparities are morally wrong and an obstacle to human flourishing. She concludes, and I would agree, that at the core of Judaism is the devotion to the sacred text, as we heard from Adina, and to the interpretive process that continually recreates the text, as has been done through the ages by our sages and great rabbis. Yet women, she points out, were excluded from that interpretive process by both Orthodox and non-Orthodox Judaism. And she suggests the interpreters failed to note the extent to which the texts themselves ignored and marginalized women. So let me conclude by challenging all of us as Jewish leaders, men and women, to chart a course going forward that fully recognizes the dignity and equality of each and every one of us. Let us lead the way to a new chapter in our Jewish history that celebrates the roles and participation of men and women equally in all parts of our community, both here in Israel, in the United States, and around the world. Thank you.